Welcome to this exploration of how we can measure a person's level of maturity through the lens of their ego. Welcome to our channel, PEDIA. Ego is often misunderstood, sometimes seen as arrogance or pride, but it's much more complex. In psychology, ego relates to how we perceive ourselves, protect our identity, and relate to others. And maturity reflects how well a person manages their ego in daily life.
What is ego maturity? Ego maturity is a concept used to describe how well an individual balances their sense of self without letting ego drive destructive behaviors. A mature ego doesn't mean being boastful or overly confident. It means having self-awareness, emotional regulation, humility, and resilience. People with mature egos can hold a strong sense of identity without needing constant validation. They accept criticism, manage conflict healthily, and maintain meaningful relationships. In contrast, immature ego often involves defensiveness, insecurity, impulsiveness, and a constant need for approval. Key dimensions to measure ego maturity. Let's look at some observable dimensions that can help us measure ego maturity. Thank you for the clarification. Below is the journal article-style elaboration on the concept of self-awareness as a core indicator of ego maturity. This will fit seamlessly into a scholarly or 1. Self-awareness, the foundation of ego maturity. Self-awareness represents a central component in evaluating ego maturity and serves as a psychological cornerstone in differentiating between a reactive, immature ego and a reflective, developed one. From a clinical and theoretical standpoint, self-awareness refers to the capacity of an individual to recognize, observe, and evaluate their internal states, thoughts, emotions, impulses, and motivations with relative objectivity. In the context of ego psychology, self-awareness enables individuals to recognize the subtle mechanisms through which the ego seeks validation, defends against perceived threats, or avoids discomfort. A person with high ego maturity is not only able to acknowledge their behavioral patterns, but can also link them to underlying emotional responses and situational triggers. This internal monitoring system allows for regulation and conscious adjustment, promoting adaptability in interpersonal and intrapersonal domains. Moreover, self-awareness acts as a regulator between the ego and the superego, in Freudian terms, helping individuals mediate internal conflicts without externalizing blame or resorting to projection. It becomes particularly relevant when dealing with ego threats such as criticism, failure, or social comparison by allowing individuals to ask reflective questions like, "Why did I feel triggered by that?" Or, "What insecurity did this challenge expose?" Empirical studies in emotional intelligence, Goleman, 1995, further emphasize that self-awareness is a predictive factor in emotional regulation, empathy, and effective decision-making. It reduces impulsivity and increases cognitive flexibility, traits often absent in ego-immature individuals who exhibit defensiveness, denial, or aggression under pressure. In summary, self-awareness is not merely the knowledge of one's strengths and weaknesses. It is the active, ongoing process of tuning into internal signals, understanding emotional causality, and using that insight to align one's responses with both personal values and social harmony. As such, it forms the first and perhaps most critical dimension in measuring the maturity of the ego. 2. Emotional regulation, a marker of inner stability. Emotional regulation is a key psychological function that reflects the maturity of an individual's ego and their capacity to navigate stress, criticism, and interpersonal tension without resorting to defensive or destructive behaviors. It refers to the ability to monitor, evaluate, and modify emotional reactions in ways that are appropriate to the context and conducive to long-term well-being. In individuals with a mature ego, emotional regulation emerges as a form of internal leadership. Rather than being overtaken by impulsive responses such as anger, withdrawal, or passive aggression, these individuals demonstrate the capacity to pause, assess the emotional landscape, and respond with intention rather than reactivity. This process reflects a high degree of ego strength, a concept rooted in psychoanalytic theory, where the ego can withstand tension and delay gratification in service of realistic outcomes and ethical standards. From a developmental standpoint, emotional regulation evolves through a combination of neural maturation, social learning, and self-reflection. It is intimately linked to the prefrontal cortex, which governs executive functions such as impulse control, empathy, and decision-making. A mature ego utilizes these neural resources to filter emotional input and prevent it from overwhelming the self or spilling destructively into relationships. Importantly, emotional regulation does not imply emotional suppression. Mature individuals do not avoid or deny their feelings. Instead, they allow emotions to be acknowledged, processed, and integrated in ways that maintain both internal coherence and external harmony. This contrasts with the emotionally immature ego, which may catastrophize minor setbacks, lash out when confronted, or internalize resentment, leading to chronic dissatisfaction and social dysfunction. Within the broader psychological framework, emotional regulation is also a defining element of emotional intelligence. Goleman, 1995, Resilience, Bonanno, 2004, and Secure Attachment Styles, Bowlby, 1969. Each of these constructs demonstrates how the mature ego becomes not only emotionally intelligent but socially functional, capable of navigating the complex dynamics of relationships, work environments, and personal challenges with grace and psychological flexibility. In conclusion, emotional regulation is a clear behavioral and neurological expression of ego maturity. It reveals the degree to which a person can remain grounded in the face of emotional provocation, demonstrating that maturity is not found in emotional detachment, but in emotional mastery. 3. Humility and openness. Signs of a secure ego. Humility and openness are essential psychological indicators of ego maturity, often representing the ego's capacity to coexist with vulnerability, uncertainty, and the limitations of the self. While the immature ego tends to overinflate the self-image and resist external input, the mature ego accepts that learning, growth, and truth frequently lie beyond one's current understanding or personal pride. Humility, in this context, does not equate to self-deprecation or weakness. Instead, it reflects an accurate and balanced self-assessment where strengths are acknowledged without arrogance and limitations are recognized without shame. This nuanced self-view enables individuals to detach their worth from their need to be right or superior. In doing so, they become more adaptive, coachable, and relationally competent. Openness, closely related to cognitive flexibility and curiosity, is the willingness to entertain new ideas, perspectives, and feedback without experiencing ego threat. An open individual is not easily offended by disagreement nor threatened by differing worldviews. Rather than defaulting to defensiveness, they view alternative perspectives as opportunities for growth and enrichment. This quality is particularly vital in collaborative, cross-cultural, and interdisciplinary environments where rigidity and ego-centeredness often lead to conflict or stagnation. The combination of humility and openness reflects what psychologist Carol Dweck describes as a growth mindset, a belief that intelligence, abilities, and character are not fixed traits but can be developed over time. A mature ego thrives under this mindset, understanding that acknowledging not knowing is not a weakness, but the first step toward deeper knowledge and self-improvement. Philosophical and spiritual traditions across cultures echo similar sentiments. In Buddhist psychology, for instance, the concept of beginner's mind emphasizes openness and receptivity, free from the ego's compulsion to control or categorize. In Stoicism, humility is regarded as the foundation of wisdom, recognizing that the only true power lies in self-governance, not dominance over others. Furthermore, empirical studies in leadership and organizational psychology have shown that leaders who demonstrate humility admitting when they are wrong, sharing credit, and seeking input are more effective and better liked by their teams. Owens and Heckman, 2012. This supports the notion that humility and openness are not only ethical virtues, but also strategic competencies in modern life. In conclusion, humility and openness reveal an ego that is no longer obsessed with image maintenance or dominance, but is instead secure, self-aware, and intrinsically motivated to grow. These traits are core to ego maturity because they allow individuals to remain teachable, empathetic, and aligned with reality rather than illusion. 4. Ability to handle criticism, the ego's stress test. The ability to handle criticism serves as a practical and revealing measure of ego maturity. Unlike more theoretical or introspective traits, how a person receives and responds to criticism is an observable behavior that often reflects the deeper workings of their self-concept, emotional regulation, and interpersonal development. In psychological terms, this ability represents an individual's tolerance for ego threat and thus becomes a diagnostic indicator of ego strength. Immature egos tend to respond to criticism with defensiveness, denial, minimization, projection, or even retaliation. These defensive behaviors, well documented in Freudian defense mechanisms, are designed to protect the fragile self from perceived attacks on identity or self-worth. In contrast, a mature ego has developed the psychological resilience to pause, reflect, and discern the truth or value embedded within feedback, even when it is uncomfortable or imperfectly delivered. Research in organizational behavior and leadership studies supports this view. Leaders who demonstrate maturity in handling criticism are often more trusted, adaptable, and effective because they do not personalize feedback as an assault, but rather integrate it as data for self-improvement. In this context, their ego becomes a tool for self-awareness, not a shield against accountability. Critically, the ability to accept criticism does not imply passive submission or the blind acceptance of negative judgments. It instead reflects a capacity to evaluate criticism objectively, differentiating between constructive insights and biased or unfair attacks. This requires cognitive flexibility, emotional intelligence, and a balanced self-image that is not easily destabilized by external opinions. From a developmental psychology perspective, this trait emerges through repeated exposure to interpersonal feedback, successful emotional regulation, and internalized self-worth that is not wholly dependent on others' validation. The mature ego no longer needs to win every argument, prove every point, or defend every action. It is capable of saying, "You might be right," or "I need to reconsider that," without feeling diminished. Moreover, being able to handle criticism is often intertwined with growth mindset and secure attachment to frameworks that emphasize the individual's ability to maintain self-integrity while remaining open to growth and connection. A securely attached individual, for instance, is more likely to assume that criticism is given in good faith and does not imply rejection. This interpersonal confidence, in turn, supports a non-defensive engagement with feedback. In conclusion, the ability to handle criticism is a litmus test for ego maturity. It shows whether the individual's sense of self is so brittle that it must be constantly defended, or whether it is stable and flexible enough to absorb challenge, learn from it, and emerge stronger. In a world that increasingly rewards adaptability and emotional intelligence, this quality is not only a psychological strength, it is a vital life skill. 5. Interpersonal relationships. The ego in social context. Interpersonal relationships offer one of the most revealing mirrors of ego maturity. While internal markers such as self-awareness and emotional regulation are critical, the relational field comprising friendships, romantic partnerships, family ties, and professional interactions presents frequent, real-world challenges that test the stability and flexibility of the ego. A mature ego contributes to healthy, reciprocal relationships marked by respect, empathy, and mutual growth. It allows the individual to engage in social bonds without constant attempts to control, dominate, impress, or win approval. In contrast, an underdeveloped ego often seeks validation through others, oscillating between people-pleasing and controlling behaviors, depending on whether the goal is admiration or safety. Empathy is a hallmark of ego maturity in interpersonal dynamics. An empathetic person can discenter themselves momentarily, stepping out of their own worldview to genuinely consider another's thoughts or feelings. This capacity signals an ego that is not overly self-referential or threatened by difference. As a result, interpersonal communication becomes less combative and more constructive. Further, mature individuals demonstrate the ability to apologize and forgive, both of which require a softening of the ego's prideful instincts. The ability to say, "I was wrong," or to accept an apology without lingering resentment reflects an ego that is secure enough not to equate mistakes with shame or to weaponize hurt as leverage. This supports relational repair and resilience over time. Another defining feature of ego maturity in relationships is the willingness to set and respect boundaries. A mature ego understands that closeness does not require enmeshment, nor does autonomy require emotional distance. Boundaries are not seen as rejections or threats, but as healthy frameworks for preserving trust and respect. This boundary literacy fosters psychological safety within the relationship, allowing for deeper authenticity and long-term connection. Psychologically, these patterns align with secure attachment styles, Bowlby, 1969, Ainsworth, 1978, where the individual has internalized the belief that they are worthy of love and that others can be trusted to meet emotional needs without manipulation or coercion. In contrast, individuals with ego fragility often demonstrate anxious or avoidant behaviors, pursuing validation or detachment as means to regulate their self-esteem. Moreover, interpersonal conflict is not avoided by the mature ego but approached with a willingness to listen, reflect, and repair. Rather than winning the argument, the goal becomes protecting the relationship. This distinction requires a shift from egocentric to relationship-centric thinking, a sign that the individual's identity is not defined by dominance or perfection, but by the quality of their connections. In conclusion, the way one navigates interpersonal relationships serves as a real-time, observable indicator of ego maturity. It reflects the culmination of several other traits: self-awareness, humility, emotional regulation, and openness, and reveals whether the ego functions as a bridge to others or as a barrier to intimacy and collaboration. Psychological theories supporting ego maturity. Several psychological models provide frameworks to understand ego maturity. Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development suggest that ego maturity develops as we resolve conflicts like identity versus role confusion and intimacy versus isolation. Jane Levinger's ego development theory maps out stages from egocentric to integrated ego, highlighting growing self-reflection and complexity. Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence theory links ego maturity to emotional self-awareness and empathy. These frameworks all point to ego maturity as a dynamic process, one that grows with experience, reflection, and emotional work. Practical ways to assess ego maturity. In daily life or professional settings, measuring ego maturity can be subtle but possible. Here are practical ways to observe it. Behavior under stress. Does the person respond calmly or impulsively? Behavior under stress. The revealing pressure test. Behavior under stress offers one of the most accurate and unfiltered lenses through which ego maturity can be assessed. While it is relatively easy to appear composed or mature in calm conditions, true ego strength is best evaluated in moments of emotional intensity, uncertainty, or perceived threat. Stress acts as a psychological X-ray, making visible the structure and resilience, or fragility, of the ego behind the surface personality. A mature ego, when placed under stress, tends to remain grounded, self-aware, and communicative. The individual may experience discomfort, frustration, or anxiety, but they possess the internal resources to self-regulate, seek constructive solutions, and maintain relational respect. They are more likely to pause before reacting, ask for space rather than lashing out, and articulate their needs rather than project their fears. In contrast, an immature ego tends to revert to primitive defense mechanisms when threatened. This includes denial, blame-shifting, aggression, victimhood, stonewalling, or passive-aggressive behaviors. These stress responses are not only emotionally disruptive, but also signal that the individual's sense of self is easily destabilized by external pressures. In such cases, ego immaturity becomes a liability damaging relationships, impairing decision-making, and amplifying conflict. From a neurobiological perspective, behavior under stress is closely linked to how effectively an individual can manage amygdala reactivity, the brain's emotional alarm system, with top-down regulation from the prefrontal cortex. Mature individuals tend to show greater neurological integration balancing emotion with cognition, which enables them to respond rather than react. This aligns with emotional intelligence models and resilience research, both of which highlight emotional control in crisis as a central trait of psychological maturity. Practical assessment of stress behavior might include observing responses to interpersonal conflict or sudden changes in plans, reviewing past behavior in high-pressure work or personal situations, analyzing patterns in crisis communication, whether the individual seeks clarity or fuels confusion, evaluating emotional recovery time, how quickly the person returns to a regulated state after distress. Additionally, mature behavior under stress is not defined by perfection, but by recovery. Even emotionally intelligent individuals may feel triggered, but their maturity lies in how they process, reflect, and take responsibility for their actions post-crisis. They are willing to apologize, course-correct, and learn from the event rather than suppress it or blame others. In sum, stress is not only an inevitable part of life, but a vital diagnostic tool in understanding ego development. Observing how individuals behave under pressure offers practical and predictive insight into their true level of ego maturity, revealing whether the self remains integrated or collapses into reactivity when tested. Response to feedback. Do they listen openly or react defensively? Response to feedback, a mirror of ego development. An individual's response to feedback, especially unsolicited, critical, or corrective feedback, provides a powerful and practical window into their level of ego maturity. Unlike general social behavior, which can be polished or performed, how someone receives and processes feedback is often instinctive, exposing deeper patterns of self-perception, emotional regulation, and psychological security. A mature ego is characterized by receptivity to feedback without defensiveness or collapse. This does not imply blind acceptance of all opinions, but rather a measured, thoughtful engagement with external perspectives. Individuals with developed ego maturity are capable of listening to criticism without instantly rejecting it, reflecting on its merit, and even expressing gratitude for insights that can foster personal growth. This openness arises from a stable self-concept, one that does not perceive feedback as a threat to identity, but as a tool for development. In contrast, an immature ego often interprets feedback through a lens of personal attack or shame. This leads to knee-jerk defenses such as denial, that's not true; deflection, you do that too; rationalization, it's not a problem, it's just how I am; emotional withdrawal or aggression. Such responses suggest a self-image that is still fragile, conditional, or inflated, one that cannot tolerate disruption without reactivity. In professional or relational settings, this immaturity undermines trust, hinders collaboration, and stalls growth. From a developmental psychology standpoint, the ability to process feedback constructively reflects cognitive and emotional milestones, such as metacognition, the capacity to think about one's own thinking, and affect regulation, the ability to manage emotional responses. These functions are typically associated with advanced executive functioning and are cultivated over time through self-reflection, secure attachment, and consistent social-emotional learning. Practical ways to assess response to feedback include observing whether the individual asks clarifying questions or becomes defensive, noting whether feedback is followed by behavior change or justification, analyzing whether the individual seeks feedback proactively or avoids it altogether, identifying emotional cues such as body language, tone, or nonverbal withdrawal when receiving critique. In addition, a mature ego will often distinguish the intent behind the feedback, recognizing whether it is supportive, corrective, or malicious, and respond accordingly. Even when receiving poorly delivered criticism, mature individuals can separate tone from substance and extract what is useful without escalating conflict. Culturally, some individuals may be conditioned to view feedback as hierarchical judgment or social shaming. However, ego maturity allows for transcending cultural reflexes in favor of intentional, growth-oriented interpretation. This flexibility further reflects emotional intelligence and intercultural competence. In summary, an individual's response to feedback is not just a momentary reaction, it is a long-term signal of how they process truth, growth, and vulnerability. A mature ego listens before reacting, integrates insights without collapse, and leverages feedback as a mirror for evolution rather than a trigger for defense. Conflict resolution. Can they negotiate and find compromise? Conflict resolution. The ego's capacity for repair over domination. Conflict is an inevitable component of human interaction, yet it is also one of the most revealing psychological events when assessing ego maturity. The way an individual approaches, navigates, and repairs conflict reflects not only their emotional intelligence and communication skills, but more fundamentally, the maturity of their ego structure. It distinguishes between those who use conflict as an arena for dominance and those who use it as an opportunity for clarity, understanding, and relational growth. An ego-mature individual approaches conflict not as a personal battlefield, but as a necessary and even valuable exchange. They are more likely to seek resolution than revenge, to understand rather than simply to be understood. This stems from a self-concept that is secure enough to withstand disagreement without collapsing into shame or inflating into hostility. Characteristics of ego maturity in conflict resolution include staying emotionally regulated, even when challenged or misunderstood. Listening actively to the other party's viewpoint without interrupting or dismissing. Willingness to own mistakes or misunderstandings without over-defensiveness. Focusing on shared goals rather than individual victories. Valuing the relationship above winning the argument. In contrast, ego-immature individuals tend to escalate conflict or avoid it entirely. Their responses often involve blame, withdrawal, sarcasm, or personal attacks. These behaviors stem from an ego that perceives conflict as a threat to self-worth or power, rather than as a neutral part of social dynamics. Immature egos are frequently driven by either slash or thinking win slash lose, right slash wrong, and tend to frame disagreement as a challenge to identity rather than a space for mutual problem solving. From a psychodynamic perspective, unresolved internal conflicts, particularly those tied to childhood experiences of powerlessness, invalidation, or enmeshment, may resurface during external conflicts. The immature ego reacts not just to the issue at hand, but to unprocessed emotional material beneath the surface. This results in disproportionate reactions, personalizing neutral disagreements, or replaying old relational patterns. Furthermore, conflict resolution requires what psychologist Carl Rogers termed unconditional positive regard, a willingness to approach the other person with empathy and non-judgment. Mature individuals can recognize that resolving conflict does not require suppressing one's own truth, but involves integrating multiple perspectives into a resolution that honors both self and other. Practical ways to assess ego maturity in conflict resolution include observing how the individual initiates difficult conversations, noting whether they seek resolution or simply express grievances, evaluating their ability to stay engaged versus shutting down or escalating, looking for patterns of reconciliation or repeated rupture in relationships. Additionally, ego maturity in conflict is often accompanied by the capacity for self-reflection after the fact. Mature individuals are able to look back on an argument and identify what they could have done differently, an indication of humility, insight, and the desire to grow beyond ego reactivity. In summary, conflict resolution is not merely a communication skill, it is a profound indicator of how developed and integrated the ego has become. Where the immature ego seeks to win, the mature ego seeks to heal, clarify, and build trust, turning moments of division into gateways for deeper connection and self-awareness. Social interactions. Are they empathetic and respectful or dominating and dismissive? Social interactions. Ego in the public arena. Social interactions offer a dynamic and accessible way to observe ego maturity in everyday life. These interactions, whether casual, professional, or intimate, act as a living laboratory where the ego is continuously tested in real time. How individuals behave socially reveals not just personality traits or communication styles, but deeper indicators of ego development, self-perception, and relational security. A person with a mature ego tends to engage in social environments with a balance of confidence and humility. They neither dominate conversations nor fade into passivity. They listen as much as they speak, display genuine curiosity toward others, and demonstrate an ability to adapt their communication to suit the needs and dynamics of the group. These behaviors reflect an ego that is internally anchored and does not need to perform or seek validation constantly. Key traits of ego maturity in social settings include a respectful dialogue, especially with people of differing views or social positions. Inclusivity, rather than exclusion or favoritism in group dynamics. Appropriate self-disclosure, showing self-awareness and boundaries. Empathy and perspective-taking, allowing others to feel heard and valued. Minimal use of status signaling or attention-seeking behaviors. In contrast, individuals with ego immaturity often use social spaces to seek validation, assert dominance, or manage insecurity. Their interactions may be marked by boastfulness or overcompensation, interrupting or controlling conversations, oversensitivity to criticism or lack of attention, social comparison and competitiveness, clinging to group hierarchies or social cliques as ego reinforcement. Such behaviors signal that the ego is still dependent on external affirmation to maintain a coherent sense of self. This external referencing creates volatility in self-esteem and can cause friction in group settings where mutual respect and reciprocity are key. From a social psychology perspective, ego maturity in social interactions often aligns with high emotional intelligence, Goleman, 1995, secure attachment, Bowlby, 1982, and lower narcissistic traits. These individuals tend to have a well-differentiated sense of self that allows them to engage authentically without feeling threatened by differences or needing to dominate the social space. Practical ways to assess ego maturity in social contexts include observing how the person interacts with individuals of lower status or perceived lesser importance. Watching their behavior in group dynamics, do they listen or monopolize? Noting whether they can handle not being the center of attention without withdrawing or acting out. Assessing how they respond to other success, failure, or vulnerability. Moreover, mature individuals are generally socially secure. They do not need constant reassurance, are not overly reactive to social slights, and can tolerate ambiguity or temporary disconnection without spiraling into self-doubt or blame. This stability fosters deeper, more authentic relationships over time. In conclusion, everyday social interactions often taken for granted serve as rich data points for assessing ego maturity. Whether in a boardroom, dinner party, or online forum, the way one shows up in shared space reflects how developed the ego is in balancing self-expression, other awareness, and relational integrity. Self-presentation. Do they show authentic confidence or exaggerated posturing? Self-presentation. The outer expression of inner stability. Self-presentation refers to the way individuals choose to express and manage their identity in social contexts. It encompasses everything from verbal communication, appearance, and body language to how people curate their presence in professional settings or on social media. As a practical metric, self-presentation offers a nuanced glimpse into the maturity of a person's ego, revealing whether one's self-image is governed by internal coherence or external performance. Individuals with mature egos present themselves in a manner that is consistent, authentic, and contextually appropriate. Their self-presentation reflects an internal clarity. They know who they are and do not feel the need to overstate, conceal, or manipulate their identity to gain acceptance or control. This authenticity does not imply rigidity. Rather, it suggests that the individual can adapt across different environments without compromising their core values or dignity. Characteristics of ego maturity in self-presentation include authentic expression, free from excessive impression management. Consistency across contexts. They are essentially the same person at work, at home, and in public. Balanced humility, comfortable talking about strengths without bragging and weaknesses without shame. Selective transparency. They know what to share and with whom, demonstrating emotional boundaries. By contrast, ego-immature individuals often over-identify, with how they are perceived. Their self-presentation may be curated to project superiority, invulnerability, or victimhood. Such individuals may exaggerate achievements or status markers, shift personas dramatically depending on the audience, overuse appearance, status symbols, or jargon as identity props, become distressed or reactive when their image is questioned or unacknowledged. These behaviors indicate a fragile or inflated ego that relies on external validation to sustain a coherent sense of self. In such cases, self-presentation becomes a performance, a mask designed not to reflect the self, but to protect it. From a developmental psychology and identity theory standpoint, healthy self-presentation is the result of successful ego integration, where the individual no longer feels compelled to prove their worth externally. This echoes Erik Erikson's later stages of psychosocial development, particularly the transition from identity formation to integrity and generativity. The mature self-presentation that emerges is less about being admired and more about being aligned, showing up as a whole person, not a role. Practical ways to assess ego maturity through self-presentation include noting whether the individual shows consistency in their values and tone across settings, observing how they respond to moments where their image is challenged. Do they double down or reflect? Evaluating their ability to share both successes and failures honestly, without distortion. Watching for signs of self-awareness in how they portray themselves online or in public. Additionally, the most telling sign of ego maturity in self-presentation is the lack of urgency to impress. Mature individuals are comfortable letting their presence, actions, and values speak for themselves. They may still care about making a good impression, but that desire is in service of connection, not self-preservation. In conclusion, self-presentation is not just about outward behavior. It is a mirror of how well the ego has been integrated internally. A mature ego leads to a form of self-expression that is grounded, consistent, and free from the compulsion to perform. As such, observing how someone presents themselves offers practical and immediate insight into the level of their ego development. Using these observations, psychologists, coaches, or leaders can gauge ego maturity to support personal growth or team dynamics. Why measuring ego maturity matters. Understanding ego maturity helps us build healthier relationships, improve leadership and teamwork, foster emotional well-being, encourage personal development. By identifying ego-driven behaviors and nurturing maturity, individuals can move toward more balanced, fulfilling lives. To wrap up, ego maturity is less about eliminating the ego and more about managing it wisely. A mature ego reflects self-awareness, emotional control, humility, and healthy relationships. By measuring these traits, we can better understand ourselves and others and cultivate a life led by conscious choice rather than unconscious defense. Thank you for joining this reflection on measuring a person's level of maturity based on ego. Stay curious, stay open, and keep evolving.